Every year, hundreds of climbers from across the world set their sights on the highest point on Earth. They train for years, spend fortunes, and push their bodies to the absolute limit. Some make it to the top and return home as heroes. Others never come back at all. The mountain does not care who you are, how experienced you are, or how badly you want it. Once you enter the death zone, you are entirely on your own, and the slightest miscalculation can end everything in an instant. What you are about to read is not a celebration of reckless ambition. It is a record of what actually happens when human limits collide with the most unforgiving environment on the planet. These are real people, real decisions, and real consequences. Some of them were beginners who had no business being on that mountain. Others were among the finest climbers in the world. And in the end, Everest treated them all the same. Here are the most horrific deaths ever recorded on the world's highest peak and the stories behind them. Shreeya Shah had dreamed of standing on the summit of Mount Everest for as long as she could remember. She was born in Nepal in 1979, which meant the mountain had loomed over her childhood in the most literal sense. When she eventually emigrated to Canada and built a new life for herself, the dream followed her across the ocean. It did not fade with time or distance. If anything, it grew stronger. And sometime around 2011, Shreeya decided she was going to stop dreaming and start climbing. There was just one fundamental problem. Shreeya had never climbed an 8,000-meter peak. She had no formal mountaineering training, no experience with high-altitude environments, and no technical skills that would prepare her for the demands of Everest. Most serious mountaineers spend years working their way up through progressively more challenging expeditions before they even consider attempting the world's highest mountain. Shreeya skipped all of that. She was going straight to the top. To fund the expedition, Shreeya told sponsors and supporters that she was an experienced mountaineer. She painted a picture of competence that did not exist. She drained her entire life savings and assembled a team of Sherpas to guide her up the mountain. By the time she arrived at base camp in the spring of 2012, those Sherpas could already see what was coming. Her pace was wrong, her technique was off. She struggled with basic maneuvers that any competent high-altitude climber would handle without a second thought. The warning started almost immediately. Her Sherpas told her, repeatedly and plainly, that she wasn't ready for this mountain. They explained what the death zone would do to a body that was not prepared for it. They told her that the consequences of continuing were likely fatal. Shreeya listened to every single warning and ignored all of them. She had come too far. She had sacrificed too much. She had told too many people that she could do this. Turning back was simply not something she was willing to consider. On May 18, 2012, Shreeya and her team departed from Camp 4, the highest of Everest's established camps and the final staging point before the summit push. From Camp 4, a strong, well-acclimatized climber can typically reach the summit in somewhere between 10 and 12 hours. The conditions that morning were harsh but manageable. Everything depended on speed, efficiency, and the ability to move through the death zone before the body began to truly break down. Shreeya took 16 hours to reach the summit. By the time she stood on top of the world, she had already spent 4 more hours in the death zone than was safe. Her oxygen reserves were critically depleted, her legs were failing, and every experienced person on that mountain knew what those numbers meant. The rule on Everest is brutally simple. If you cannot descend from the summit under your own power, you are not going to survive. She had arrived at the top of the world, but she had nothing left to get back down. Her Sherpas attempted to help her begin the descent, but her body was too far gone. Her legs buckled. She collapsed into the snow. They pulled her upright and she fell again. They tried again and again, but at that altitude, With oxygen depleted and core temperature dropping, there is a physical ceiling on how much one person can do for another. You cannot carry a full-grown adult down a near-vertical face at 8,000 meters. Climbers began to pass them. Some paused. Most kept moving. Every person on that mountain was fighting their own battle just to stay alive, and stopping too long in the death zone means adding your own name to the list of those who never came back. Shreeya's Sherpas faced an impossible decision. They could stay with her and likely die themselves, or they could descend and survive. One by one, as the night deepened and temperatures plunged toward negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit, they made the only choice they could. Shreeya was left alone on the mountain. The winds howled around her. Her oxygen ran dry. Her body temperature continued to drop. In those final hours, as the darkness closed in and the cold became absolute, she still had moments of terrible clarity. She was aware of what was happening. She knew that help was not coming. Her last words, spoken to her Sherpa before he was forced to leave, were 2 syllables that carried the weight of everything she had lost. "Save me." By the time dawn broke over Everest on May 19, 2012, Shreeya Shah was dead. She was 33 years old. Her husband was waiting for her back home. Her frozen body remained on the mountain, still wrapped in the flag she had brought to plant at the summit. Every climber who passed her in the days and weeks that followed saw what Everest had taken. A woman who had wanted this so badly that she had refused to hear a single voice telling her no. Her story is not a simple one to judge. There is something genuinely human in her refusal to give up on a dream. There is courage in the fact that she climbed it all. But there is also a recklessness in her approach that made her death all but inevitable. She bypassed every safeguard that the mountaineering community had built through decades of tragedy and hard experience. She lied to get there. And the mountain did what the mountain always does to those who arrive unprepared. Shreeya's death prompted serious conversation about the responsibility of expedition operators to screen their clients. Some companies, particularly the low-budget operators who take on anyone willing to pay, have faced criticism for accepting climbers who clearly lack the physical and technical foundation for high-altitude climbing. A permit to climb Everest does not mean you are capable of climbing Everest, and no amount of determination can change the chemistry of the air at 8,000 meters. Her flag is still up there. Her body is still up there. And somewhere on the upper slopes of Mount Everest, frozen in time and in place, Shreeya Shah remains exactly where her dream brought her. Not on top of the world, triumphant and alive, but somewhere below the summit on the long and fatal road, back down. A reminder that wanting something desperately enough to sacrifice everything for it does not guarantee you will survive the wanting. Greater than. If you wanted to design the perfect mountaineer in a laboratory, you might end up with something that looked a great deal like Ueli Steck. The Swiss climber was not just good at what he did, he was operating at a level so far beyond conventional skill that the wider climbing world had essentially run out of superlatives to describe him. They settled eventually on a nickname, the Swiss Machine. It was not an affectionate joke. It was an acknowledgement that what Ueli did on a mountain was not entirely explicable in human terms. Ueli was born in 1976 in Langnau, Switzerland, and he took to climbing the way some people take to breathing. By the age of 18, he had already soloed the north face of the Eiger, one of the most technically demanding and genuinely dangerous walls in the entire Alps. That climb alone would have been a career-defining achievement for most alpinists. For Ueli, it was the beginning. Over the following 2 decades, he systematically rewrote the record books on routes that other elite climbers had spent years attempting. His speed was what made him famous. Routes that had taken legendary teams multiple days, Ueli was completing in hours. He set a new record on the Eiger's north face, finishing in just 2 hours and 47 minutes. He soloed the south face of Annapurna, the world's 10th highest mountain, via a route that was considered so dangerous that most professional climbers flat out refused to attempt it. He did it alone, he did it fast, and he walked away from it, which surprised a great many people who had expected him not to. The wider mountaineering community had a complicated relationship with Ueli's approach. His admirers saw a climber who had elevated the sport to an entirely new dimension, pushing human capability to a point that seemed almost abstract. His critics argued that he was reckless, that his methods relied too heavily on everything going right, and that one bad day would be enough to end him. Ueli was aware of these criticisms and took them seriously. He did not dismiss them, he simply continued climbing. By the spring of 2017, Ueli had set his sights on what would have been, if successful, perhaps the most audacious achievement in the history of high-altitude mountaineering. He intended to climb Mount Everest without supplemental oxygen, and then, without descending to base camp, traverse directly to Lhotse, the world's 4th highest mountain, and summit that as well. A continuous oxygen-free traverse of 2 8,000ers. Nobody had ever done it. Very few people in the world were even theoretically capable of attempting it. He arrived in Nepal in April 2017 with his climbing partner, Tenji Sherpa. Almost immediately, things began to shift. Tenji developed severe frostbite during their acclimatization period and was forced to remain at base camp, unable to continue. This left Ueli in a situation he was entirely comfortable with, and that many others would have found deeply unsettling. He was now going to do this alone. He adjusted his plans, prepared his gear, and continued with his usual methodical precision. Before making his main attempt on Everest, Ueli decided to complete a warm-up climb, a solo ascent of Nuptse, a nearby peak that rises to just over 7,700 meters. It was, by the standards of what he was planning, a relatively modest undertaking. On the evening of April 29, 2017, he sent a text message to Tenji, letting him know that he was planning to head out toward Nuptse early the next morning. Tenji sent back a reply asking him not to go alone. Ueli never responded. On the morning of April 30th, Ueli Steck set out from camp in the pre-dawn darkness. A Sherpa working on the mountain that day spotted him sometime later, moving steadily up a ridge at around 23,000 feet. He was alone. He was moving well. And then, in a moment that left the Sherpa who witnessed it unable to speak for some time afterward, Ueli was gone. A scream echoed down the mountain. It lasted only a second. And then there was silence. Ueli had fallen. The distance his body traveled before coming to rest was approximately 3,300 feet, roughly the combined height of 3 Eiffel Towers. His helmet, his gloves, and his harness were gone by the time he was found, likely torn from his body during the violence of the fall. There were no witnesses to the moment itself. Nobody knows what caused him to lose his footing, whether a hold gave way, whether a moment of inattention had crept in, whether the mountain simply found the margin it had always been looking for. His body was recovered by helicopter. The climbing world, which had spent years watching Ueli do things that seemed impossible, was left in a state of quiet disbelief. Not grief exactly, not at first, because grief requires accepting something that the mind is not yet ready to accept. Ueli Steck had always come back. Every route, every wall, every record attempt, he had always come back. And now he had not. And there was nothing left to say that did not feel completely inadequate. The critics who had called him reckless were, in a narrow technical sense, proven correct. His approach had always carried risk. He had always known it carried risk. He had accepted that risk as the price of operating at the level he operated at. What those critics missed, and what his supporters always understood, was that the recklessness and the genius were the same thing. You could not separate one from the other. The climbing that made Ueli Steck extraordinary was inseparable from the climbing that eventually killed him. What happened on that ridge above Nuptse on the morning of April 30th, 2017, will never be fully known. There are theories but no witnesses, speculation but no certainty. What is known is that Ueli was 40 years old, in the greatest physical condition of his life, and preparing for what would have been the defining achievement of a career already filled with defining achievements. He was, by any reasonable measure, at the top of his profession and at the absolute peak of his powers. And the mountain took him anyway. That is the part that stays with you. Not that he died, because everyone dies, but that it happened like this. Not on Everest, not on Annapurna, not on one of the massive routes that had built his legend, but on a warm-up climb, on an ordinary morning, on a mountain he had probably considered barely worth mentioning in his journal. The Swiss Machine, the greatest alpinist of his generation, was gone before the day had properly begun. Ueli Steck left behind a legacy that will not be diminished by how he died. The records he set remain standing. The routes he opened remain as testaments to what human beings are capable of when physical conditioning and mental control reach their absolute limit. But the climbing world also lost something that day that had nothing to do with records. It lost the sight of a man who made the impossible seem, if not easy, then at least achievable. And that is a different kind of loss entirely. Time equals 1.0 seconds / greater than the morning of April 25th. 2015 began like any other morning in a busy Everest season. Base camp was alive with the particular energy that builds during the weeks before a summit window opens. Hundreds of climbers from dozens of countries were there, all at different stages of their preparation. Some were adjusting equipment, some were eating, resting, reviewing weather reports. Some were simply sitting in the early light and looking up at the mountain they had come all this way to climb. None of them had any idea what was coming. Nobody at base camp that morning had any idea that they were sitting on the edge of one of the most catastrophic natural disasters in Nepal's modern history. The ground beneath them, the rock and ice and compressed earth that formed the base of the Himalayas, had been building stress along a fault line for decades. At precisely 11:56 in the morning, that stress reached its breaking point. A 7.8 magnitude earthquake detonated beneath the Nepali landscape with a force that the country had not experienced in over 80 years. The shaking hit base camp with almost no warning. The ground lurched and rolled, equipment scattered, tents collapsed. Climbers who had been standing were thrown off their feet. Those who had been sitting grabbed at anything solid and found there was nothing solid to grab. The earthquake lasted for nearly a minute, but the real threat had not yet arrived. Somewhere above them, on the flanks of Pumori, the shaking had done something far worse than rattle tents. It had set the mountain itself in motion. The avalanche came from the slopes of Pumori, a peak that rises directly above base camp and had always been regarded as a source of potential risk, though never quite like this. Climbers heard it before they saw it. A deep, low rumble that built with terrifying speed into something that sounded like the end of the world. And then they looked up. A wall of ice, snow, and pulverized rock, rising 200 feet above the surface and moving at hurricane force, was coming directly at them. There was nowhere to run. There was no time to run. The avalanche hit base camp in seconds. The force of the impact was beyond description. Entire tent structures that weighed hundreds of kilograms were launched through the air as if they weighed nothing. Climbers who had been caught in the open were thrown enormous distances. Some were buried immediately. Others were picked up by the blast wave that precedes the snow and flung across the rocky terrain of the glacier. The medical tent, the one facility at base camp equipped to handle trauma injuries, was completely obliterated in the first moments of impact. When the snow finally settled, base camp looked like a scene from a war zone. Those who had survived and were physically capable of standing began moving through the wreckage immediately, calling out names, pulling at debris, trying to find anyone still alive beneath the surface. The calls were answered sometimes, other times they were not. The injured lay in open air on a glacier with no medical facility, no surgical equipment, and no way to evacuate anyone until helicopters could be mobilized from far lower altitude. The final death toll at base camp from the avalanche was 22 confirmed fatalities. It was the deadliest single event in the mountain's recorded history. But the disaster was not finished. Higher up on Everest, trapped between Camp 1 and Camp 2 at elevations above 6,000 meters, approximately 200 climbers had survived the earthquake, only to find themselves in a new and potentially equally lethal situation. The icefall, the chaotic and ever-shifting section of glacier that forms the only navigable route between base camp and the upper mountain, had been devastated by the earthquake. The icefall route was gone, the ladders that teams of Sherpas spend weeks setting up across crevasses and unstable seracs, the fixed ropes, the carefully established path that is rebuilt each season, all of it had been rearranged beyond recognition. The 200 climbers above were stranded. They could not descend safely. They could not ascend safely either. They were stuck at altitude with limited supplies, in conditions that were growing colder as the afternoon wore on, and with the very real possibility that aftershocks could trigger further avalanches at any moment. Those 200 climbers spent the night on the mountain. It is difficult to convey what that night was like. They were exhausted, frightened, and in many cases injured. They had survived one disaster and were waiting to see if a second one was coming. Aftershocks rattled through the mountain through the evening and into the night. Every tremor brought a fresh wave of terror, a moment of wondering whether this was the one that would bring more snow down on top of them. Some people prayed, some people held each other, some simply sat and waited. The helicopter rescue operation that began the following morning was one of the most technically complex and dangerous evacuation efforts ever attempted in the Himalayas. Pilots were operating at extreme altitude in unpredictable conditions, landing on surfaces that had been altered by the earthquake, pulling out survivors one or two at a time and ferrying them down to lower altitude before going back up again. It took until April 27th, 2 full days after the earthquake, before the last of the stranded climbers was confirmed safe. The 2015 Everest disaster forced a complete shutdown of the climbing season. No further summit attempts were made that year. The entire international mountaineering community, Sherpas and clients, and guides and officials alike, was forced to stop and absorb what had happened. 22 people had died at base camp. Thousands more had died across Nepal as villages and towns were flattened by the earthquake. The scale of the destruction was almost impossible to process. The footage that came out of base camp in the hours and days after the avalanche hit was some of the most disturbing ever recorded in a mountaineering context. Cameras had been rolling as the avalanche struck, and the resulting video, chaotic and terrifying, circulated around the world within hours. People watching in offices and living rooms thousands of miles away could hear screaming, could watch the white wall approach, could see the moment the world went dark and still as the snow engulfed everything in its path. What April 25, 2015 demonstrated, above everything else, is that Everest's danger is not confined to the death zone. You do not have to be near the summit to be at risk. You do not have to be a climber at all. Base camp sits at 5,364 meters above sea level, which is higher than most mountains in the world, and yet in the context of Everest, it is considered the relatively safe, ground-level starting point. On that April morning, it proved to be anything but. The mountain killed 22 people at its base before they had even begun to climb it. It trapped 200 more in the dark above them, and it served notice, once again, and in the clearest possible terms, that no amount of preparation, planning, experience, or good fortune provides immunity from what can happen here. Everest is not a challenge to be managed. It is a force to be respected absolutely, or not approached at all. The spring of 1996 was shaping up to be one of the most commercially ambitious Everest seasons in history. Multiple guided expeditions were converging on the mountain simultaneously, each carrying paying clients who had spent years and fortunes for their chance at the summit. Among them were two of the most respected guides in the business. Rob Hall from New Zealand, founder of Adventure Consultants, had summited Everest 5 times and was known for running the tightest, most safety-conscious operation on the mountain. Scott Fisher, the American founder of Mountain Madness, was his philosophical counterpart. Bold, charismatic, and deeply confident in the ability of strong climbers to push through difficulty. Both men were leading clients toward the summit on the same day. The plan called for a midnight departure from Camp 4 on May 10th, a controlled ascent through the pre-dawn hours, a summit no later than mid-afternoon, and a full descent back to camp before the evening weather patterns set in. It was, on paper, a sound plan. What Everest does with sound plans is a matter of historical record. Problems began accumulating almost from the moment the teams left camp. The pace was too slow. Several clients were struggling with the altitude far more than anticipated, and the bottlenecks this created had cascading effects on every team moving up the mountain simultaneously. Oxygen supply management, which requires precise timing and rationing to work correctly, began to break down as delays stretched the timeline beyond what had been planned for. By the time the teams reached the Hillary Step, the near vertical rock band just below the summit, they found that the fixed ropes had not been installed. Someone was supposed to have gone ahead and installed those ropes. Nobody had. The result was a traffic jam on the most exposed and dangerous section of the route, with climbers from multiple teams queuing in sub-zero temperatures, while guides worked frantically to set the ropes that should have already been in place. Every minute spent waiting, there was another minute of oxygen being consumed, another degree of body temperature lost, another increment of physical deterioration that would need to be overcome on the way back down. Rob Hall had a rule. It was not a guideline or a preference. It was a non-negotiable command, born from years of experience. If you are not on your way down from the summit by 2 in the afternoon, you turn around. No exceptions. That rule had kept clients alive on previous expeditions. On May 10th, 1996, Rob Hall broke it himself. He was still ascending with Doug Hansen, a postal worker from Washington State, who had attempted Everest the previous year and turned back just short of the summit. Doug was so close this time, and Rob could not bring himself to stop him. By 3 in the afternoon, climbers who should have been 2/3 of the way down the mountain were still going up. By 4, some were still not at the summit. And in the late afternoon sky above Everest, something that weather forecasters had not predicted was building with terrible speed. A storm. Not the gradual kind that gives you time to plan. The kind that arrives without warning and turns the mountain into a roaring white chaos of wind and ice within minutes. It hit in the early evening, and it hit everything at once. Temperatures dropped to 40 below. Winds exceeded 70 miles per hour. Visibility collapsed to near zero. Climbers who had been descending in the last of the daylight found themselves suddenly blind, unable to see the route markers, unable to orient themselves, unable to determine whether the slope they were stepping onto led toward camp or toward a drop of several thousand feet. People began to fall. People began to collapse. And up near the summit, Rob Hall and Doug Hansen were still there. Doug Hansen never made it down from that summit. He collapsed somewhere near the top, beyond the point at which any meaningful assistance could be given. Rob Hall stayed with him. As night fell and the storm raged, Rob Hall sat near the top of Mount Everest alone, in darkness, in catastrophic cold, with no oxygen remaining. Base camp reached him by radio. They begged him to move, to try, to do something. He told them he was stuck and too weak to descend on his own. Base camp managed to patch through a call to John Arnold, Rob's wife, who was pregnant with their first child back in New Zealand. Over a crackling satellite connection, through the roar of the storm, Rob Hall spoke to his wife one last time. He told her not to worry too much. He told her to sleep well. He called her his sweetheart. Those were the last words anyone ever heard from Rob Hall. By the time the storm cleared, he was dead, still at his post near the summit, having refused to abandon the client he felt responsible for. Scott Fisher, meanwhile, was losing his own battle on the South Col. He had been struggling through the day, showing signs of high-altitude pulmonary edema, a condition where fluid builds in the lungs and progressively suffocates the victim from the inside. His speech had been slurred since the summit. His movements had been uncoordinated. His lead Sherpa, Lopsang Jangbu, had been practically hauling him down the mountain for hours. When Scott could no longer move at all, he told Lopsang to go for help and collapsed in the snow. He was conscious when Lopsang left him. He would not be conscious for much longer. Anatoly Bukreev, a guide attached to Scott's expedition, made one of the most remarkable rescue efforts the mountain has ever seen that night. In hurricane-force winds, without supplemental oxygen, he located and saved multiple stranded clients who would otherwise have died where they lay. He then went back for Scott Fisher. When he reached him, Scott was barely alive. His oxygen mask was empty. His hands were ungloved. His down suit had come partially open, one arm sticking out of the fabric. It is a recognized symptom of terminal hypothermia. The body, in its final stages, generates a false sensation of burning heat, and the dying person removes their clothing. Scott Fisher was 40 years old, and he was dying on a mountain he had summited before. Bukreev did what he could. He stayed as long as he could. And then, knowing he had reached the limit of what any human being could do in those conditions, he moved Scott's body off the main climbing route, covered his face, and descended. Scott Fisher's remains are still on Everest. The 1996 disaster ultimately claimed 8 lives, but from its wreckage came one of the most extraordinary survival stories the mountain has ever produced, belonging to a man named Beck Weathers. He was not inexperienced. That is an important distinction to make. David had already summited Cho Oyu, the world's 6th highest mountain, without supplemental oxygen. He had attempted Everest twice before, in 2003 and 2004, turning back on both occasions for safety reasons. He was methodical, disciplined, and sober in his approach to risk. He was also, by the time he made his 3rd and final attempt in the spring of 2006, deeply committed to a style of climbing that left him with almost no margin for error if anything went wrong. He booked his spot through Asian Trekking, one of the lowest-cost expedition operators on the mountain. No personal guide, no dedicated Sherpa support, no backup team waiting at lower camps with fresh oxygen and emergency equipment. It was a stripped-down, self-reliant approach that made philosophical sense to David and practical financial sense given his resources. What it did not provide was a safety net. If something went wrong, high, on the mountain, there was nobody specifically tasked with coming to find him. On the evening of May 13, 2006, David Sharp left his highest camp and began his solo attempt on the summit via the northeast ridge route on Everest's north side. The route took him past one of the mountain's most grimly famous landmarks, the remains of a climber who had died in the same spot a decade earlier, and whose distinctive bright green mountaineering boots had become an involuntary waymarker for every team that passed. David moved past the cave and kept going. He had a summit to reach. At some point in the pre-dawn hours of May 14th, David Sharp reached the summit of Mount Everest. The details of that moment are uncertain because there was nobody with him to record it. What is known is that he made it to the top, which represented the achievement of something he had worked toward across 3 separate expeditions and many years of disciplined preparation. What is also known is that when he reached the top, he had already consumed too much of everything that he needed for the way back down. He was running low on oxygen. He was running low on the physical reserves that come only from rest, food, and hydration, none of which are adequately available in the death zone, regardless of how well you prepare. He was hours into a solo night ascent at extreme altitude with no support and no backup. By the time he turned around and began to descend, his body was already failing. His pace slowed, his thinking clouded, and at approximately 8,500 meters, a few steps from the limestone overhang where the body of the green-booted climber had lain for a decade, David Sharp sat down. He did not get back up. This is what happens in the death zone when the body reaches its limit. The hypoxia that sets in above 8,000 meters does not announce itself as a crisis. It feels, to the person experiencing it, more like a deep and irresistible fatigue. The desire to sleep is overwhelming and feels entirely reasonable. The critical error is that sleep at that altitude, in those conditions, is not rest. It is death arriving slowly and with its face turned away. Climbers began passing David Sharp as dawn broke over the north side of the mountain. Some registered him as another body in the cave, the same cave they had been briefed about before their climb. The man with the green boots was a fixed point on the route, an expected sight, something you noted and moved past. Several climbers on that day made the assumption that what they were seeing was the known body, not a new one. They were looking at David Sharp, alive, and they kept moving. Others looked more carefully. A Turkish team paused beside him and looked into his face. His eyes opened. He was alive. He was barely able to speak, barely able to move, his limbs already in the early stages of freezing. They tried to help him stand and found it was not possible. They had their own summit to reach, their own oxygen to ration, their own survival to manage. They moved on. A Sherpa from a separate expedition stopped later in the day, knelt beside David, shook him by the shoulders. The Sherpa told him he had to move. He told him he had to stand up. He told him that if he did not get up right now, he was going to die in this cave. David Sharp opened his eyes and looked at the man kneeling over him. He said something that the Sherpa would repeat in interviews for years afterward. He said he just wanted to sleep. That was it. 4 words. The Sherpa, already running dangerously low on his own oxygen supply, made one more attempt to drag David to his feet. It did not work, and then he had to go. By the time the last descending climbers passed the cave that evening, David Sharp was no longer responding to anyone. The number of climbers who had passed him while he was still alive was eventually calculated at more than 40. When that figure became public knowledge in the days following his death, the reaction was immediate and severe. News organizations around the world ran the story. Edmund Hillary, the first man to stand on Everest's summit, said publicly that the climbers who had passed David should feel ashamed of themselves. The conversation that followed was uncomfortable and necessary. It forced the mountaineering community to confront questions that had been circling for years. What are your obligations to a dying stranger when you are at 8,500 meters, and stopping means risking your own life. Is a rescue attempt that kills both the rescuer and the person being rescued morally superior to walking past? There are no clean answers to these questions. David Sharp's death did not produce them, but it made ignoring the questions impossible. His body remained in the cave for nearly a year before a team of Sherpas removed it from the main route and pushed it over the north face, ending its time as an unwitting landmark and giving David something closer to a resting place, however impermanent. He had climbed Everest alone, without fanfare, without support, on a shoestring budget, purely because he wanted to. He had reached the summit, and then he had sat down in the same cave as the man before him and let the cold take him. David Sharp was 34 years old. For more than 2 decades, climbers making their way up the northeast ridge route on Everest's north side passed the same landmark at approximately 8,500 meters. A shallow limestone overhang, barely large enough to call a cave, cut into the rock face of the mountain. Curled inside it was a figure lying on its side, knees drawn to the chest, arms folded, face obscured by a layer of ice that never melted at that altitude. The figure had been there so long that climbers who had never met him knew exactly who he was. They knew him by his shoes. Bright neon green, unmistakable, a detail that had become, grotesquely, a piece of navigation. Green boots told you where you were. His real name was almost certainly Tsewang Paljor. He was born in 1968 in Ladakh, in the far north of India, a region where the Himalayas are not a distant dream, but a daily reality. He joined the Indo-Tibetan Border Police, an organization that combined law enforcement with high-altitude operational capability, and he became a climber of considerable skill. By 1996, he had been selected for one of the most historically significant expeditions his country had ever organized. The first ever attempt by an Indian team to summit Everest from the Tibetan side via the northeast ridge. The significance of this cannot be overstated. Previous Indian expeditions had climbed Everest from the Nepalese side. Summiting from Tibet via the north, a technically distinct and, in many ways, more challenging route, would be a genuine first. The team that achieved it would be making history in a way that resonated far beyond the world of mountaineering. National pride was attached to this climb in a way that added pressure to every decision the team made. And that pressure, as it so often does on Everest, contributed to choices that should not have been made. The expedition's leadership had genuine concerns about the weather as the summit window approached in early May 1996. The team assessed the forecasts and concluded that conditions were deteriorating toward something dangerous. The instruction came down. The summit attempt should be abandoned. The mountain would have to wait. For most of the team, this was the end of the discussion. For 3 climbers, one of whom was Tsewang Paljor, it was not. Paljor and 2 colleagues, Dorje Morup and Tsewang Smanla, made the decision to push for the summit anyway. They departed in defiance of the team's leadership and climbed into the day. By mid-afternoon, they had radioed back that they had reached the summit. Whether they had actually stood on the true summit or had mistaken a false peak, a common and potentially fatal error in the featureless white of high altitude, has never been definitively established. What followed makes the distinction almost academic. Time equals 1.0 seconds, / greater than the storm that the expedition leader had warned about, arrived exactly when he had said it would. It arrived fast, and it arrived with everything it had. Temperatures plunged below 40 degrees Celsius. Winds exceeded 100 kilometers an hour. The visibility that had been marginal dropped to almost nothing. The 3 climbers, wherever they were on the upper mountain, were now in the worst possible place at the worst possible time, with no possibility of safe descent before the storm took them. None of the three were ever found above the cave. What the evidence strongly suggests is that Tsewang Paljor, in whatever condition he was in after the storm had done its work, managed to descend further than his teammates. He reached the level of the rock overhang. He was out of oxygen. He was frostbitten beyond the point of functional use of his extremities. He was, in the clinical language of high-altitude medicine, dying. He crawled inside the overhang, tucked his body into the smallest shape it could make, and waited. No help came. There was no mechanism by which help could have come. The rest of the team was lower on the mountain, aware that something had gone wrong, but unable to ascend through the storm to assist. By the time conditions improved enough for anyone to venture upward, the window for intervention had closed. Tsewang Paljor died in that cave, alone, in the dark, in temperatures that made everything stop. He was 28 years old. His 2 teammates were never found. His body, through an accident of placement and altitude, became permanent. The temperature at 8,500 meters does not fluctuate enough to allow decomposition. The body did not move because there was no mechanism to move it. And so Tsewang Paljor remained exactly where he had died, visible to every climber who passed, identifiable by the color of his boots, because nobody, in the early seasons after his death, knew his name with certainty. He was simply the man in the green boots, and then he was simply Green Boots. The name spread through the climbing community without ceremony and without intention. It was a practical label, not a cruel one. Climbers in the death zone use landmarks to orient themselves, and this body, in this specific location, had become a reliable landmark. It told you where you were, it told you how far you had to go, and it told you, without any need for additional commentary, what the mountain could do to you if things went wrong. Every person who climbed the Northeast Ridge for more than 2 decades passed Tsewang Paljor on their way to the top. In 2006, a decade after Tsewang Paljor died in that cave, another climber lay down inside the same overhang and died in the same way. His name was David Sharp. He was found curled against the wall of the cave, his body positioned so close to Tsewang Paljor's remains that multiple climbers descending past the site assumed he was the original Green Boots, the same body they had been briefed about, and kept moving. In death, 2 men who had never known each other became entangled in a story that neither of them had chosen. David Sharp's death reignited interest in the identity and story of Green Boots, the silent companion who had witnessed more than a decade of Everest ascents from the same fixed position. Researchers and journalists began digging into the records of the 1996 Indian expedition. The name Tsewang Paljor emerged, supported by circumstantial evidence, as the most likely identity of the man in the cave. His family, living in Ladakh, was eventually located and informed. The closure, if it can be called that, was partial at best. No official identification was ever made. For years, the official position of various parties on the question of Tsewang Paljor's identity was deliberately vague. There are political and cultural dimensions to the question that complicate a clean resolution. What is not in dispute is the human reality. A young man from northern India, driven by national pride and personal ambition, climbed into a storm he had been warned not to climb into, and died in a cave on the northeast face of Everest. He has been there ever since, watching the clouds move across the Tibetan plateau, as climbers from every nation on Earth step past him on their way to the summit he was trying to reach. Tsewang Paljor's body was reportedly covered over or moved at some point in the years after 2014, removed from the immediately visible position on the main route. The landmark of Green Boots, which had guided climbers for nearly 2 decades, was quietly retired without announcement. If the intention was to give him a quieter resting place, away from the stream of eyes that had passed over him for so many years, It was a small and belated kindness. He deserved more than a nickname. He deserved to be remembered as the person he was, a 28-year-old climber named Tsewang Paljor, who wanted to make his country proud. Francys Arsentiev was trying to do something that no American woman had ever done. She wanted to stand on the summit of Mount Everest without using supplemental oxygen. It is one of the most demanding physical achievements available to a human being, something that only a small fraction of the world's elite mountaineers have managed, and it requires not just extraordinary fitness and technical skill, but a particular kind of high-altitude physiology that cannot be trained into a body that does not already possess it. Francys believed she had that physiology. She was going to find out if she was right. She arrived at Everest in May 1998 with her husband, Sergei Arsentiev, a highly experienced Russian climber who had summited Everest previously. They were climbing as a team, which was both their greatest strength and, as events would prove, a contributing factor in the chain of decisions that would kill them both. Climbing as a couple means that when one person makes a choice to push further, the other tends to follow. The bond that makes two people climb together is also the bond that makes it almost impossible to turn back when your partner refuses to. The couple's acclimatization and preparation went reasonably well, but even from the early stages, it was clear that climbing without oxygen at this altitude came at a severe cost. Their pace was far slower than that of the supplemented climbers around them. Every step required more effort. Every rest stop lasted longer. Other climbers moved past them with the disconcerting efficiency of people operating with a physical advantage they could not match. Francys and Sergei fell further and further behind the pace that safe high-altitude climbing requires. On May 22, 1998, they made their first summit attempt from Camp 4. They turned back. They were too slow, had started too late, and would not have been able to complete the climb before conditions deteriorated. It was the right decision, and making it took discipline. They descended, rested, and tried again the following day. On May 23rd, Francys and Sergei Arsentiev pushed through the death zone without supplemental oxygen and reached the summit of Mount Everest. Francys had achieved what she had come to do. She was the first American woman to stand on top of the world without bottled air. Every year, hundreds of climbers from across the world set their sights on the highest point on Earth. They train for years, spend fortunes, and push their bodies to the absolute limit. Some make it to the top and return home as heroes. Others never come back at all. The mountain does not care who you are, how experienced you are, or how badly you want it. Once you enter the death zone, you are entirely on your own, and the slightest miscalculation can end everything in an instant. What you are about to read is not a celebration of reckless ambition. It is a record of what actually happens when human limits collide with the most unforgiving environment on the planet. These are real people, real decisions, and real consequences. Some of them were beginners who had no business being on that mountain. Others were among the finest climbers in the world. And in the end, Everest treated them all the same. Here are the most horrific deaths ever recorded on the world's highest peak and the stories behind them. But reaching the summit without oxygen, at the pace they had been forced to climb at, had left both of them in a critically depleted state. The descent that followed was disorganized and frightening. At some point during the climb back down toward Camp 4, Francys and Sergei became separated. The details of exactly how this happened have never been fully established. What is known is that Sergei reached Camp 4, and Francys did not. When Sergei realized she was not behind him, he did not wait. He gathered oxygen from the camp, turned back around, and went up into the dark to find her. It was a decision made from love. It was also a decision that killed him. Because Sergei went back up into the death zone, At night, in deteriorating conditions, after already having summited without supplemental oxygen. His reserves were completely gone. He was running on nothing but the will to reach his wife. And somewhere in the darkness above Camp 4, that was no longer enough. Sergei Arsentiev disappeared into the mountain. His body was found days later lower on the slope, where the evidence suggested he had fallen. The man who had gone back to save his wife did not come home either. On the morning of May 24th, an Uzbek climbing team moving up toward their own summit attempt discovered Francys Arsentiev on the slope above them. She was alive. Barely, but she was alive. She was lying in the snow, unable to move under her own power, her body temperature in critical decline, her face and extremities showing severe frostbite. She was conscious enough to know that people were there. She turned her face toward them. She spoke words that the climbers who heard them have never been able to forget. "Don't leave me." The Uzbek climbers were in an impossible situation. They could see that Francys was alive. They could also see, with the brutal clarity that high altitude imposes on everything, that there was no realistic mechanism by which they could save her. Carrying a full-grown adult down steep, technically demanding terrain at 8,000 meters without the equipment for a proper rescue is not something that willpower can compensate for. They gave her their supplemental oxygen. They wrapped her in a sleeping bag. They left food beside her. And then, as she had asked them not to, they left. When the Uzbek team descended past the same spot on their way back down from the summit, Francys was dead. She was lying with her arms crossed over her chest, her face turned skyward, her expression so peaceful that the first people to see her described the sight as someone sleeping. That description caught and spread through the climbing community. Francys Arsentiev, who had climbed to the top of the world on nothing but her own body's capacity, became known on Everest as Sleeping Beauty. Her body remained in that position, visible from the main route, for 9 years. The years that followed her death were hard ones for the people who had known and loved her. Her son, Paul Di Stefano, was 14 years old when his mother and stepfather both died on Everest within days of each other. He grew up knowing that the mountain had taken both of his parents and that his mother's body was still there on public display, identifiable to anyone who climbed that route. He grew up knowing she was known not by her name, but by a nickname that, however well-intentioned in its origin, reduced her to a curiosity on the side of a mountain. In 2007, a climbing team made a deliberate decision to do something about that. They had the equipment, the capability, and the intention to move Francys from her resting place on the main route and give her a burial of sorts, wrapping her in an American flag and moving her off the path to a position where she would no longer be a spectacle. The effort took several hours and carried significant physical risk. When it was done, a note was placed with the body on behalf of her son. It said simply that she was not forgotten. The story of Francys Arsentiev sits in a different emotional register from many of the other deaths on Everest because of what happened after she was found alive and left. Climbers who encountered her that day have spoken about it for years afterward. Some have expressed guilt. Some have tried to explain and contextualize their choices in the language of survival. The Uzbek team that found her first did what they could within the constraints of where they were. Others who passed her later did less. And for 9 years, she lay where the mountain had left her, in the open, in the cold, with the wind moving over her and the climbers moving past. Francys Arsentiev was 42 years old when she died on Everest. She had achieved the goal she had set herself, the first American woman to summit without oxygen, and the mountain had taken everything else from her in return. Her husband, who loved her enough to go back into the death zone to find her, died on the same mountain 2 days later. Their son lost both parents to the same peak within the same week. She is gone from the route now. She has a better resting place than the one Everest gave her. Her name was Francys Arsentiev. She was a wife, a mother, and a mountaineer. That is what she should be remembered as. 7 people, 7 stories, and in each of them, the same mountain, the same cold, the same indifference. Everest does not distinguish between the prepared and the unprepared, the legendary and the unknown, the cautious and the reckless. It takes from all of them equally. Shreeya Shah, who dreamed her whole life of standing at the top of the world. Ueli Steck, who redefined what a human being could do on a mountain. The 22 people at base camp who never even had the chance to begin climbing. Rob Hall, Doug Hansen, Scott Fisher, and all the others caught in the storm of 1996. David Sharp, alone in a cave on the North Face. Tsewang Paljor, who wanted to make his country proud. Francys Arsentiev, who just wanted to go home. What ties all of them together is not incompetence or recklessness or bad luck, though all 3 of those things feature somewhere in these stories. What ties them together is the same thing that ties every human being who has ever stood at the base of that mountain and looked up. The belief, however briefly and however irrationally held, that they were going to be the ones who made it. That the rules that had claimed everyone before them would not apply to them in the same way. That they were different enough, strong enough, or prepared enough. Everest is not built from stone and ice alone. It is built, in part, from the remains of the people who discovered they were wrong. The mountain is still there. The bodies of many of the people in these stories are still there too, frozen into the slopes, preserved by the same cold that killed them. Every year, new climbers arrive at base camp with the same dreams and the same determination. Some of them will reach the summit. Some of them will not come back. And the mountain will remain exactly as it has always been, enormous and silent and utterly without mercy, waiting at the top of the world for whoever comes next.